we would like you to observe. If you haven't already been muted, please do so now. If you have a question, please utilize the Q&A button on the screen. We have allowed ourselves enough time to answer questions, if not real time, at the end of the presentations. If you have a general comment or desire to share a thought with others, please use the chat function. This webinar will be recorded, and at the end of it, we will tell you about sending you a link and how to connect with it. Now, without further ado, let me introduce Julie Seidel, who is our host for the evening. Julie?
Hi, it's great to see everybody out there virtually. And I'm so glad that you're participating in this series. Tonight, we are getting ready to celebrate the 150th anniversary of the Pigeon Point Light Station. And we've assembled an amazing team of interpreters from the light station to share its history and a little bit about its future with you. So I'm going to introduce those folks first, tell you what to look forward to tonight, and then that team will take it away. We're going to meet Joe Rogers, who's a California States Park Interpreter 1. He started at Pigeon Point in July of 2019, and currently he's responsible for all the parks and beaches between Gray Whale Cove State Beach and Pigeon Point Light Station. Originally from California's Central Valley, Joe spent most of his summers growing up camping with his parents in various places throughout the Sierra and along the Northern California coast. So it's no surprise then that he's always wanted to work outdoors. Joe graduated from UC Davis with a degree in wildlife, fish, and conservation biology, and he enjoys baking, exploring new state and national parks, and being outside as often as possible. You'll meet Charles, Charles DesBaillets is the newest member of the Pigeon Point Light Station's interpretive team. He first experienced outdoor education as a volunteer teaching assistant for a series of summer camps held by UC Santa Barbara at their research stations in Mammoth Lakes. And then in 2016, he began his career with California State Parks at Bodie State Historic Park, where he led tours, performed living history skits, and helped protect the park's valuable cultural resources. And apparently it's animal resources too, as we were hearing just a minute ago when he jumps down wells to rescue bunny rabbits. He studied both anthropology and history at UC Santa Cruz and is excited to apply those disciplines as he learns and shares Pigeon Point's unique story. And you'll also get a chance to meet Julie Barrow if you haven't met Julie before. Julie's been associated with Pigeon Point Light Station for more than 20 years. She began as a volunteer, leading tours of the lighthouse and the grounds. And since 2007, she's worked for California State Parks as the program coordinator and currently as the special projects coordinator at Pigeon Point. Her primary role is to support restoration and preservation efforts for the historic lighthouse. She'll tell you more about her projects, but we're going to get started with some deep history.
Okay.
And Joe's going to take it away talking about early navigation.
Thank you so much for that wonderful introduction, Julie. Greatly appreciated. Okay, so I'm going to start us off today by talking about navigation in the 19th century through tools, maps, and stars or celestial objects. And specifically, we're going to learn a little bit about how properly navigating the open oceans was essential for safely traveling long distances in the 19th century. But I want us to start by kind of thinking about how do we navigate today in the modern world? Well, for most of us, we use our cell phones and modern GPS that give us step-by-step instructions to get to and from our destinations. We also use things like highway signs and road signs to help us ensure that we're following the right route. Now, this isn't always perfect. Sometimes there are flaws. Sometimes they make us take longer routes than maybe we know of for our back routes. Sometimes they make us take wrong turns. Sometimes they get really upset when we make wrong turns. So they're by no means perfect. But with that in mind, let's think a little bit about how you would get from point A to point B in the 1800s, in the 19th century. How would you get to and from your destination? Well, the fastest, the easiest, and the most reliable way was by clipper ship. So you would go from one coast to the other, would involve a journey that was thousands of miles long and could take up to 3 months. Now, remember that this is well before modern GPS technology that automatically tracks your location, which is what we have today as you move. So people along this journey would have to track their location manually to make sure that they were going in the right direction and following the right route. So this was done by finding your latitude, which is your location on the y-axis on a map, and your longitude, your location on the x-axis on a map. But how do you do that? Well, we're going to start with latitude. So to measure your latitude or to find your latitude, you need to use a tool that's called a sextant, which is what I have in the upper left corner of our slide here. A sextant is essentially similar to a tool that's kind of like a protractor with a scope on it. So if you look, there's a scope that you look through, and then along the bottom, there's sort of a section that you can use to measure angles. So the way that this works is you measure the angle between an astronomical object and the horizon. So astronomical objects can include things like the sun, the moon, or one or two of 57 different stars. Then you have to do some calculating. And I want you to imagine if every time you wanted to go someplace new, you had to do math first. I know that I would get lost very, very frequently. So the easiest one to use to measure to find your latitude in the northern hemisphere is the North Star. So all you have to do is measure what we call the angular height of the North Star. The angular height is the angle between the star and the horizon. So if you look right here, if everybody can see my mouse, this angle right here between the North Star and our horizon is what we would call the angular height. So once you have your angular height, you subtract that from 90, and that's your latitude. Really easy. So we're already halfway there. Now we have to find our longitude. Now, our longitude, which is again is our location on the x-axis, can be found by finding the difference between current local time and time in Greenwich, Greenwich, London, which is known as Greenwich Mean Time. And that sounds pretty easy enough, right? In fact, every 1 hour difference between local time and Greenwich Mean Time is equivalent to about 15 degrees longitude. So a 2 hour difference would mean that you were about 30 degrees west, and an 8 hour difference would mean that you were about 120 degrees west. But that brings us to a really interesting question of how do you figure out what local and Greenwich Mean Time are? Well, Greenwich Mean Time, keeping track of that is pretty easy. All you need is a tool that we call a chronometer, which is basically just a clock. You set that for what you know is Greenwich Mean Time before you leave, and it keeps track of what the time is in Greenwich throughout your journey. And so you know Greenwich Mean Time no matter where you are. So then all you have to do is figure out local time. But how do you do that? Well, the easiest way is to find what we call local noon. That's basically the point at which the sun is at its highest and is equivalent to about 12 p.m. So all you need to do is find local noon, which you can do by using your sextant, which remember helps you find the angular height of an object. So you measure the sun, its angular height throughout a period of time. And once you know that point at which it was its highest, you know that that time was local noon. So all you need to do is find out what time it was Greenwich, what time it was in Greenwich. When you found out what time local noon was, find the difference, and that's your longitude. Pretty easy enough, right? You can also find your latitude using the same thing. So you've already measured and found out what time in Greenwich local noon was where you are. So by using your nautical almanac, you can find your latitude at the same time and kind of do both. You can also do this with other celestial objects like different stars and the moon, but that's a little bit more complicated. So by finding local noon, using our chronometer and our sextant, we now both know our latitude and our longitude, and we can accurately pinpoint our location on a map so that we know where we are. That was a lot of work though, and I'm sure a lot of you are beginning to feel a little bit like this. I know I am. So this is where lighthouses come in, and they make things so much easier. Now, lighthouses work by using something that we call a Fresnel lens, and you'll hear Charles and Julie talk a little bit more about this. But Fresnel lenses work by concentrating, reflecting, and refracting light into a single direction. So we've got two different views of a Fresnel lens here. We've got a side view and a top-down view. And both of these show you the way in which these lenses redirect light into specific directions so that they can be seen further out to sea. What's also really interesting is that all lighthouses are unique. Every lighthouse is different in two different ways too. So during the day, you can use things like the geography of the land, the shape and size of your lighthouse, and its color to identify it. We call this its day mark. At night, all lighthouses have what we call a unique flash characteristic. This can be the timing of the flashes, in between the flashes, the brightness and color of the light, a lack of flashing, some lighthouses just have a steady glow, or a combination of flashing and glowing. This is what we call a flash characteristic, and it's how you can tell different lighthouses apart from each other. So how would you navigate knowing all of these things using a lighthouse? Well, let's say you're sailing on the coast, and you can only see one lighthouse off in the distance. So what you would do is you would take a compass direction of that lighthouse at a specific time. And then you just keep sailing, let's say for about 3 hours. Once that time has passed, you take another compass direction of that lighthouse. Then, using those two compass directions, plus the distance that you've traveled in the meantime, because you know how fast you've been sailing and at and how long you've been sailing for, so you can figure out distance, you can figure out your current location. Pretty easy, right? It's even easier if you can see two lighthouses at the same time. If you can see two lighthouses at the same time, you take a compass direction of one lighthouse, then you take a compass direction of the other lighthouse, and then you know exactly where you are. So just remember that whenever you're beginning to feel frustrated with your GPS on your cell phone yelling at you and telling you that you made a wrong turn and you need to make a U-turn or make another right turn or et cetera, just know that we are really lucky to be able to get where we need to nowadays so easily. And remember that even though it was difficult to master, learning how to properly navigate the open oceans was essential for safely traveling long distances in the 19th century. So now I'm going to pass things off to Charles, who's going to talk about why Pigeon Point specifically is such an important lighthouse on our coast.
Hi there, everyone. So I'm Charles DesBaillets. I am the newest member of the Pigeon Point interpretive team, and I'm going to go ahead and start sharing my presentation here. Get this all out of the way. All right, there we go. So thank you, Joe, for that little primer on navigation and how lighthouses work. And like Joe said, now we're going to talk a little bit more specifically about Pigeon Point's history on why it's so important for navigation along our little section of coastline. So I'm going to be giving you kind of a brief overview of Pigeon Point's history. And just so you know, Pigeon Point is surrounded by a much deeper history involving local native tribes, the Spanish missions, and lots of other things. But we're going to skip past all that to really dive into the story of the light station itself. As this slide suggests, that story can be a little sad sometimes. There were some pretty terrible accidents that took place here that had a huge effect on our park's history. But out of those tragedies came a lot of good things, a lot of progress, a lot of innovation, and a lot of hardworking people trying to make things better. So let's get into it. Let's see here. Hold on. There we go. Now, the story of Pigeon Point really starts in 1848 when John Marshall first discovered gold at Sutter's Mill. At that time, only about 15,000 non-native people lived in California. But by the end of 1849, that population had already jumped to 100,000 and would only continue to grow. You can see that population explosion on the graph here. This was one of the largest mass migrations in American history. And as you heard in Joe's presentation, most people at the time were traveling here by boat. So this rapid influx of people meant huge increases in maritime activity. The best example of this is San Francisco Bay. Before 1848, the bay was only used by around 10 ships a year, and those were mostly whalers. But in 1849 alone, 650 ships made port in San Francisco. And by the time the rush had really ramped up in 1852, the bay was serving almost 1,200 ships a year. And obviously, that huge increase in traffic made lighthouses more necessary than ever. So because of the huge demand and the amount of money starting to flow in from California, the federal government allocated $148,000 for 16 lighthouses along the West Coast. 10 of those were in California, and 4 were centered right around the San Francisco Bay. Alcatraz was the first of these lighthouses. It started operation in 1854. And then as you can see here, the original lighthouse was actually torn down in 1909 with the construction of the prison on Alcatraz Island. The prison was actually going to block off the lighthouse, so they needed to build a taller tower. Then those other 15 lighthouses you can see on the map there were all completed by 1858. But Pigeon Point was not one of these original 16 lighthouses. So why Pigeon Point and when Pigeon Point? And here we're actually going to answer 2 different why questions. First, why put a lighthouse at Pigeon Point? And second, why is it called Pigeon Point anyways? So Pigeon Point is a very dangerous place for ships. It's very rocky. It jets way out into the what would otherwise be open ocean, and lots of those rocks are hidden just beneath the waterline. Also, the long sweeping curves you can see on the map here between Año Nuevo, Franklin Point, and Pigeon Point can easily draw wayward vessels right into those rocks. And all of these issues were magnified by the dense fog that often makes navigation at sea nearly impossible. It was even worse back then than it is today. All these factors came into play when Pigeon Point's namesake, a ship called the Carrier Pigeon, sank just a few hundred yards from where the lighthouse now stands. It was actually the ship's maiden voyage. She had sailed all the way from Boston Harbor trying to reach San Francisco. And after several days of dense fog, knowing they were nearing the bay, they turned eastward to find the coastline, but ended up crashing right into the point instead. This was such a big event in local history that they named the point for this shipwreck, Pigeon Point, after the carrier pigeon. So in this picture, you can see the rocks off Pigeon Point and just how dangerous they can be. But this is actually not the carrier pigeon, and the carrier pigeon was hardly the last shipwreck at Pigeon Point. The next accident happened only 3 days later when a steamboat called the Seabird crashed into the rocks, actually while attempting to salvage the remains of the carrier pigeon. No one died in either of those accidents, but that was not necessarily typical for shipwrecks around here. In the next 15 years, 3 different ships, the Sir John Franklin, the Coya, and the Hellespont, would all meet their fate at Pigeon Point under very similar circumstances to the carrier pigeon. The major difference, though, between these 3 wrecks was that they claimed a total of about 50 lives along with them. This caused a huge public outcry that eventually led to the construction of the lighthouse. But even after the lighthouse was built, accidents continued to happen. The Point Arena, which is actually the boat pictured here, sunk while loading tan bark in 1913. And the worst maritime tragedy near Pigeon Point was in 1929, when a passenger steamer called the San Juan, irresponsibly traveling at full speed through thick fog, crashed into a much larger oil tanker and sunk almost immediately. 75 men, women, and children went down with that ship. But human error and extreme weather conditions notwithstanding, the reason Pigeon Point was built was to reduce the frequency of these accidents by warning sailors about the potential hazards. After the wreck of the Hellespont in 1868, the federal government finally apportioned $90,000 for a lighthouse somewhere in the region of Pigeon Point. But because of difficulties with the selection and purchasing of a plot of land, these funds actually had to be reallocated in 1871 before construction could actually begin. The carpenter shop, water storage, fog signal, and keeper's quarters were all finished that year, and the station finally began operating its fog signal as an active aid to navigation. But because of difficulties with the brickwork, assembling the stairs, and lots of bad weather, the tower wasn't actually finished until 1872. The light was finally lit on November 15th of that year. The tower itself was built based on plans from existing lighthouses on the East Coast, rested on an 8-foot thick foundation with walls 4.5 feet thick at the base and still just about 2 feet thick at the top of the tower. Double-walled construction helped keep moisture out to protect the tower as well as equipment inside. The whole thing took about 500,000 bricks to build, and at 115 feet tall, it's actually tied with Point Arena for the tallest lighthouse on the West Coast. There's 136 wrought iron steps from the base of the tower to the top, and almost 150 if you actually start on the ground outside. So this here is the keeper's quarters after the original Victorian style duplex was converted into kind of a fourplex to comfortably house all 4 keepers and their families. That happened in 1909, and the Victorian style house was actually torn down completely in the 1960s to build the keepers' cottages you can see on the grounds today. Now, the lighthouse keepers that took care of this station were a hardy bunch. They worked long and difficult hours for very little pay. They were constantly busy cleaning, repairing, and repainting every inch of the light station, especially the Fresnel lens, which needed a lot of attention. They were always hauling fuel and other equipment to the top of the tower, watching over the light at night, keeping meticulous records, and sometimes even acting as lifeguards for drowning sailors. Under the management of various different agencies, they were always working to improve their station as well, upgrading their light source from lard oil to kerosene to electric light bulbs, and installing several different iterations of ever more modern and efficient fog signals. For all of these labors, they only received about $1,000 a year, and that's only about $20,000 a year in today's money. But still, most of the keepers were pretty happy with their positions in life and very dedicated to their work. Their families were allowed to live with them at the light station. Their children attended school just down the road at Gazos Creek. They ordered some of their food to be delivered by supply ship, and the rest they grew in gardens on the light station grounds. Their nearest neighbors would have been the shore whalers who spotted spouts from the cliffs and launched their boats from nearby beaches. And between idle days of fishing, the constant threat of shipwrecks, an occasional rum runner, and an assortment of family pets, there was always something to keep their lives interesting. But under the Coast Guard's management, all lighthouses in the US were eventually automated starting in the 1970s. Pigeon Point was fully automated by 1972, and the final lightkeeper, Jerry Jolly, finished his tour of duty and left soon after that. For a time, the station was actually left deserted and suffered from neglect, vandalism, and many other forms of mistreatment. For a short time after that, the Coast Guard stationed Sandy Tucker at Pigeon Point as a caretaker to combat these problems. And then eventually they began leasing the property to California state parks to ensure it would continue to be managed properly. In 1881, state parks began subleasing those keepers' cottages I talked about earlier out as hostels in order to increase public access. And in 1992, state parks undertook a major renovation of the tower that replaced all the doors, the windows, and repainted most of it as well. But in 2001, tragedy struck Pigeon Point once again. Now I'm going to pass it over to Julie Barrow, our Special Projects Coordinator, to tell you all about that.
So thanks, Charles. And Joe is going to load up my slideshow because I'm technically less adept at this than these guys are. And he's going to, there we go. So as Charles was saying, in December of 2001, tragedy did strike in the form of a massive winter storm. And that winter storm resulted in the tower actually being closed. And let's take a look at why. So as a result of, as Charles said, there was some major work done. The last time the tower itself was painted was in 1992. And as you can see, first of all, there's something missing in that left-hand picture. Big piece, one of two big pieces of what's called the upper belt course broke away thanks to the what's called jacking of the cast iron, the rusting and expansion of the cast iron that pulled both cast iron and brick away from an area up near the top of the tower. And the right-hand picture shows one of those two pieces. Each of the pieces is estimated to weigh between 300 and 400 pounds. So the Coast Guard determined that it was not safe, certainly not safe for people to be around the outside of it, but also because the structural integrity of the top of the tower was now compromised. This is like a metallic rubber band that had been broken. And so there's a lot of weight sitting up on top of this belt course, the lantern room, the lens, the pedestal mechanism. All of that was in danger of collapsing. So in 2000 and probably January of 2002, the Coast Guard closed the building to the public. Let's go to the next slide, Joe. So just real quickly, the tower was closed. There was a long process that the Coast Guard and the federal government went through to determine who it was going to turn the property over to. They decided they didn't want to keep it. And because state parks had been operating as a park, we were able to submit a successful application. 2005, the federal government announced that we were the recipients, but it wasn't until 2011 that the state actually got title to the property. And one of the elements of the title, which surprised a lot of us, was that the ownership of the first order Fresnel lens also transferred to California State Parks. This was something that the Coast Guard tended not to do. They kept possession or title of the lenses whenever they turned over other lighthouses around the United States. But by some magical quirk, we actually became the owners. So the first thing we did within a couple of months was to bring the lens down out of the tower to protect it and put it on display while we raised the money to restore the tower so that we could put it back up. Now, we originally thought we were going to try to raise all that money privately because back in the late 2000s, there was the financial recession, the housing crisis. And so the state didn't have the money. But by 2019, the state had appropriated about what we estimated to be about half the cost of the restoration that would have taken care of the majority of the damage, which is at the top portion of the tower. But by 2021, we were able to get a full $18+ million, which we estimate is going to pretty much take care of the entire restoration, top to bottom and inside and out. But let's take a look a little more closely as what's going to be involved. So Joe, if you, as I said, $18+ million. The cost, the completion is about 2 to 3 years once we actually get a contractor signed. Everything needs to be worked on, the iron belt courses and galleries. Everything that basically is black on the outside of the tower is cast iron. So it actually looks more brown because of the rust than black these days. The galleries or balconies both need to be replaced or restored. Brickwork and stairs on the inside, particularly the brickwork on the inside, and we'll see some pictures of that. The foundation and lower belt courses, as well as the 2 workrooms out front there. And then finally, we hope to return the lens to the top of the tower so that you can get a view like that photograph. Let's go to the next slide and get a little more into detail. So here's a graphic of the entire lighthouse. Excuse me. As you can see, everything from the lantern roof and the windows and framing of the lantern room itself, both decks and railings, there's that belt course up at the top. That's where 2 big pieces came down. The entire body of the tower, both on the outside and more importantly on the inside, brick, mortar, ironwork is going to all need to be redone. There are 2 belt courses at the bottom. Those are also going to have to be addressed, either refurbished or replaced. And finally, while we've done a little bit of work on the oil rooms, the work rooms that are referred to as the oil house there, there's going to need to be more, because even though we've got a new roof on there and we've redone the windows, there's still water getting in somehow. So we've got to deal with the water. That's what's causing most of the problems. Joe, let's go take a look at a little bit of the damage. So this is the top of the tower. And like I say, everything that's black up there is actually blackish brown because it's so rusted. If you look at the right-hand side of the photograph, where that mesh is, yes, right in there, if you look really closely, you can see that it's been sheared off. That's where those 2 big pieces of cast iron and brick fell. And to give you a different angle, the graphic on the right-hand side, the lower of the 3 arrows points to where that came out. And you can see that there's actually iron embedded in the brickwork, which is why it pulled brick away with it. We're going to work our way down the tower. The next room we're going to look at is what's called the watch room. This is above the doorway. You can see some of the cast iron on the left-hand side photograph is actually crumbling. And there's quite a bit of damage in that space. I just kept taking photograph after photograph, and you'd be here all night if I was showing them all. But suffice to say that even in this room, there's a lot of crumbling happening, salt intrusion. The photograph on the right shows the gear mechanism, the large gear that the lens would sit on top of. You can see that it is corroded, even though it's made out of brass and bronze. The salt air is having an impact on it. We know that it's going to need to be refurbished. It sits on 10 chariot wheels. Those chariot wheels are probably all going to have to be totally remade. And that's just one part of the restoration of that pedestal itself. Let's go to the next one. We're working our way down to this, what's called the service room, the room below the watch room. Here's where you really start to see the corrosive effect of the salt and the moisture getting inside that airspace that Charles talked about, that double wall construction, getting inside there and causing the mortar to just crumble. If you were to touch the mortar areas, it would just fall apart. We also have a lot of stress fractures starting to show up. We don't know exactly how they're going to go about restoring this part of the tower, whether they're going to have to, what we think is going to happen, because we're hoping that the lantern room is going to stay in place for refurbishment. That kind of implies that the brickwork below it is going to stay in place, and that they'll work their way from one area all the way around to the next area and replace all of the crumbling brick. and mortar, but we're not sure. We still have to see what the contractors finally decide. Let's go on down into the body. Again, this is 2 levels down from the lantern room, 3 levels down actually. And you can see how it just continues to creep down. This has been 20 years worth of damage. On the left-hand side, you see an interior belt course, and you can see the rust forming on it. Let's keep going and look at some stairs. Here's a couple of pictures of the stairway. Even the cast iron stairs are showing considerable salt buildup and rust. That's separation. Nothing is squishy yet, which is really good, which means we can still access the top of the tower when we need to. But if it continues much longer, we're going to start losing individual stairs, and that's going to make it very difficult to get up in there to plan the restoration. Let's keep going. All right, we're going to look at the base of the tower now. Again, those 2 lower belt courses, you can see how much rust there is. There's been some cracking and beginning of jacking, the separation from the cast iron and the brick. We also just recently, in the last couple of years, put a new roof on that building. And as I said earlier, put in new windows in that space, rebuilt the door. So it's as secure as we can make it right now, but we still know water's getting in there. So from top to bottom, this restoration is going to take a lot of effort, a lot of time. But when we finish, Joe, the goal is to put that beautiful first order Fresnel lens back up into the tower. But we also have to talk about how it got out. But before we do that, let's talk about some of the other buildings that are on the grounds where we've started some work. This is the fog signal building looking from the ocean side. You can see how beaten the exterior was by the winter storms, year after year after year, just pounding. And this is looking basically at the southwest corner of it. The south side is where the worst of the damage was. The siding itself was just separating one piece from the other and separating from the side. Those trumpets up at the top were fully rusted. Those are part of the fog signal. So 2 years ago, we were able to get in and do a full restoration of the exterior. They rebuilt the windows. The roof has been redone and it's been fully repainted. The trumpets have been redone. We even had to remove a part of the deck out there. Those of you who've been out to visit the park, remember there was a little promontory that went out that we had to close off several years ago because the foundation had become unstable there. We're in the planning process to totally redo that back deck to make it structurally more sound and safer, as well as make it broader for more visitors to be accommodated. Let's keep going, Joe. There's been so much work out there. This is this, Charles mentioned that at one point kerosene was used to light the light. This was the building that they put in to house the kerosene. Because it was so explosive, they couldn't keep it in those workrooms right underneath the tower for fear of blowing up the entire tower. There used to be a small photo exhibit in there. It wasn't very well organized. Photographs tended to disappear because they were just put on with push pins. So we were able to get the funding to totally lead abate it, repaint it, put in new benches, and actually put in new exhibits. Right after we did that, it all closed for COVID. So it's been closed for 2 years and just very recently opened up. So if you haven't seen it yet, make a trip up. The exhibits are really nice. And we've got a huge piece of whale baleen in there as well to honor the shore whalers that were out there. A little bit more, Joe, if you go to the next. Like I said, we did some, the new roof out there on the workrooms. We did lead abatement and windows. We are able, as a result of that, to take people in select small groups for very short periods of time into the lighthouse on a very rare occasion. So we're hoping that with the restoration, we can get people in on a very regular basis. All right. Done a couple of other things to improve the grounds. Those of you who remember the historic picket fence out there, much of that has been replaced around the lighthouse. The only thing that hasn't been replaced is that area up close to the lighthouse. That'll be redone after the construction. But the rest of it has been pretty much replaced and looks all nice and sparkly. And then one other thing that we're very excited about is that small schooner, lumber schooner that Charles showed sinking off of Pigeon Point. This is one of the big pieces that came from that ship. It sat at Año Nuevo for about 30 years on display. When they rerouted the trail there, we said, hey, bring it back. So it is now back on the property where it belongs. We're really excited about that. Now, you remember I mentioned that we brought the lens down, and I bet you guys don't know how it came down. So let's go take a look. It didn't come down one piece of glass at a time. The 9-foot structure comes apart in 48 panels of glass. So the individual prisms stay inside their frame. And then each panel was put into, Joe, a cradle wrapped in blankets, and believe it or not, zip-lined down right in front of the fog signal building, where it got laid out on the floor and the wall so that the lampists, the experts who know how to work with these lenses, who actually are all retired Coast Guardsmen who spent their careers working on Fresnel lenses, made sure that each piece of glass was stable in its frame, and then they put it back together, kind of like a jigsaw puzzle. Each panel has a number that matches up with the number next to it, and you just rebuild it that way. So that lens is on display, has been for the last 10 years. We hope to get it back up into the tower. And Joe, if you'd go to the next slide. We're continuing the story of Pigeon Point. A lot of hope in the process here. You can continue to track us and our progress on our Facebook page or on the State Parks website. We have a special page just on lighthouse restoration. And I'm going to take a moment to remind everybody that this is the 150th year, the 150th anniversary of the first lighting of this lighthouse. So we're planning a whole series of events over the course of the summer and fall, culminating in the anniversary celebration on Saturday, November 12th. And so we're going to have a good time all summer long. We hope you'll keep track of us on Facebook. We'll be announcing some of the events. We're going to have some presentations around the area about the lighthouse. We're going to be introducing commemorative merchandise. And as part of the celebration, fingers crossed, we're going to have a groundbreaking ceremony sometime this year. So with that, I'd like to thank everybody for your attention to the three of us. And I think we can open it up to questions.
Thank you, Joe and Charles and Julie. What a story. I think that gives me so much appreciation for the many tasks that State Parks does, and some of the undertakings are just huge. Please put your questions into the Q&A. You can also put them into the chat if that works for you. I know, Julie, I had brought up a question, and I'm not sure everybody got to see the answer for Joe and Julie, talking about using a sextant, using those navigational tools. And I'm wondering, you know, among everybody on your ship, how many people are actually skilled in using those tools? How many people can you count on to be able to get you where you're going?
Yeah, so I chimed in, and Joe, you may have some information, but usually it was somebody like the captain, maybe the first mate. If it was a big enough ship, they might have somebody who was the actual navigator. But there really were only, it was a very highly specialized skill. And so they had to rely on one or two people. And it was, if one of them got sick or died, they were in trouble. See,
So Nan is asking, when they rebuild, will they rebuild from the bottom to the top or from the top to the bottom?
you know, that's a really good question, and we're not sure. One of the original contracting teams that helped bring the lens down had talked about doing this work at other lighthouses, and they have a specialized collar scaffolding, so that the scaffolding doesn't go from the bottom to the top. It just goes around kind of like a necklace. And they would work there and then work their way down. But if they don't happen to be the winning contractor, then it will depend on how that contractor decides to go about it. But definitely the worst of the damage and the most complicated part is up at the top.
Right. Another question about the restoration comes up. Will the lens be lit up again once it's put back into place?
Oh, that's a really good question. The Coast Guard currently lists Pigeon Point Lighthouse as an active aid to navigation with an automated LED strobe on the outside upper balcony. If we were to put the lens back in to operate on a nightly basis, California State Parks would probably have to take over responsibility of operating that in accordance with Coast Guard regulations. Coast Guard would no longer be responsible for it, and it would become a private aid to navigation rather than a public aid to navigation. We are looking into that to see what kind of maintenance it requires. There are some lights that do continue to use their Fresnel lens. I'm not sure that any of them are rotating lights. I would have to do a little bit of investigating on that. That adds a whole level of complication if the bulb is not just flashing off and on. But because we would be rotating, that adds a whole level of complexity.
Interesting. I think Maggie, that answers your questions as well. And a lot of people want to know when the hostel might be open up again.
I can pop in for that one, Julie.
Thank you.
The hostel is actually open for operation right now. So people who are interested in staying in the hostel, I can go ahead and type the web address in the chat. But it is hiusa.org/Pigeon Point.
Perfect. You might have some visitors.
Last I heard, and I don't know if this is still the case, you do have to rent the whole house out. So in the past, you could rent either a bed or a room or the whole house. But because of COVID, they are requiring folks to just rent the entire house, which means that they've gone from a big number of available reservations to just 3. So they do book up very, very fast, especially on weekends. And they have a whole bunch of other requirements for how long you have to stay, but they are open. The hot tub is not, though. The hot tub is out of commission.
And the manager of the hostel just mentioned at our advisory committee meeting last week that they are looking to hopefully soon expand operations to where you can rent an individual room in the house. So that will increase availability. It still won't be on a bunk by bunk basis yet.
Maybe while some other people are chiming in either on the Q&A or in the chat. Let's see.
You know, Maggie asked us a separate question about is it safe without the lens working? And I just want to reiterate, there is an automated LED strobe that still flashes one white flash every 10 seconds. The original flash characteristic that Joe mentioned up at the top on the ocean side outer balcony. So we are an active aid to navigation, and the fishing vessels in particular, but even the larger ships going by still appreciate seeing those flashes of light every night.
Great. Robert is wondering, will the new materials be less prone to salt and weather damage?
Yes and no. Because this is a historic structure, it's on the National Historic Registry, it all has to be restored to historic standards. That means that anything that is visible to the public has to be historic materials. That means cast iron, brick and mortar, but inside the walls, they can put in stainless steel and concrete. So that will add stability to the building. It is, I should point out, unreinforced brick and mortar. There's no steel rebar or anything like that in there, but it has ridden 2 earthquakes successfully. So I see a question about, will materials be locally sourced? Again, I don't know the exact details of what's going into the bid proposal, the bid package, but it'll probably be looking for the best materials available, because again, it is a historic structure. Only certain contractors can even bid on the project. They have to have experience addressing historic restorations.
Charles was talking about the blueprint for this lighthouse being a match to some lighthouses on the East Coast. I'm wondering if we can visit the East Coast and see any twins to our lighthouse.
I can pop in, Julie, for this one.
Yeah.
There are many different lighthouses actually on the West Coast that share a very similar architectural plan to Pigeon Point. So Yaquina Head Lighthouse, which I believe is on the West Coast.
Oregon.
I'm sorry?
It's in Oregon.
In Oregon. So that's a sister lighthouse. The Point Arena actually was for a very long time identical to the Pigeon Point Lighthouse until the 1906 earthquake. So I guess not very long. But it was identical until the 1906 earthquake. When it was rebuilt after structural damage, it looks different. So it was very common when they were building lighthouses is they would take the architectural blueprints for a lighthouse. They would take whiteout and cover out the name of the lighthouse they had just built, and then write the new name of the lighthouse they were going to build.
Yeah, and there are also a couple of lighthouses on the East Coast built to the exact plans, but taller. The Body Island Light in South Carolina and the Currituck Light in North Carolina. There are also a lot of lighthouses that look very similar, that chimney-like. One of the most notable, of course, is Cape Hatteras, the barbershop pole.
Awesome. Well, if anybody has additional questions, you can always email me. My email address is the one that sent the invitation for this registration for the webinars. And I just want to take a minute before we close to say a big thank you to our speakers. You have a big job up ahead of you. And hopefully it'll be a lot of fun for you this coming summer and this coming fall to celebrate, and hopefully have a plan in place and a groundbreaking to celebrate as well. And now you have voices all across the district who've joined in tonight, who will be prepared to chat with visitors and raise a light to the work that's going on over there at Pigeon Point. This is the last of our webinar series for this season, and I really want to appreciate you all joining in and making us a stronger, richer docent, volunteer, and staff community, and also a much more informed and wise community regarding all the resources in our district. And hopefully we can come around and do it again sometime. Paul, with that, do you want to take us out?
Sure. Again, I'd like to thank all of you for joining us this evening. And want to remind you that you will be receiving an email with the YouTube links that has this webinar recorded in it. And also you're going to be receiving a survey along with that link. And we really like to have your feedback on that seminar, just to let us know how we're doing. If you're looking forward to doing this again next year, your favorite parts of it, and any feedback you can provide for us. So again, look for that email with the links and the seminar into it, and have a good evening and safe travels to everyone. Thank you.